some pictures for you. So we have all pooled our pictures together, and they're wonderful. So it'll take some time to do that, but we want to do that for you. So instead of a slideshow, you're going to hear about demons today. Actually, the theme is about having a transformative experience and telling someone about it. To hear people talk about an experience of the sacred they had can be powerful. The words, the emotions they express, sometimes they have a very deep and powerful ability to move someone from a stage of unbelief to belief. There is power in testimony, church, and I think you know that. It happens a lot at church camp. We've had some youth come back. We have two more. Gage and Skylar Stevens are there this week. But sometimes the community at camp, young people talking about an experience of faith with each other can deeply impact them. Many of you remember Melanie Harrell. Melanie was our youth pastor several years ago. Melanie was a resource person at Camp Kaleo, and one summer she was there and had this experience of God, and she couldn't put it into words. She talked to me about it, but Melanie entered seminary and went on to become a pastor and was pastoring Good Shepherd Christian Church in Macedonia, Ohio, a Cleveland suburb. And now she has taken on the administrative director of the Bethany Fellows. After touring the sacred sites in Israel, one day there was a person in our group who came over and said, "I think I just had a powerful experience." A person that you wouldn't think would say such a thing. And Graham, I'm looking at you because the place was where you and I have talked about in Israel involving water. And so it was a really cool testimony. The speaker from Kia House that we had a couple of weeks ago on Sunday morning, I had a text from a member of the congregation and said that was a powerful testimony, a powerful message that I heard today. Thank you. More often than not, people tend to not reveal these experiences of the sacred because we have a hard time putting words into them. Maybe it's a call experience or what we feel is a call from God. Or maybe it is just an experience with another who was passed on. And we don't want people to think that we're crazy. And so we don't talk about it. But the growth of the early church was dependent upon the testimony of those whose lives had been transformed in some way from an encounter early on of those who knew Jesus, and then from those who knew Jesus and passed on what they had experienced. So in today's gospel lesson, we move from Luke. Jesus and his disciples go to the other side of Galilee, and we got to see the other side of Galilee from the western edge, looking up at the Golan Heights, the other side, the Decapolis area that was still under the rule of King Herod's son, Herod Antipas. When Jesus steps out of the boat, the lesson tells us that a Gerasene man runs to meet him. The man is said to be possessed by a demon. Now, demons and angels were common among those in the first century BC and the first century BCE or AD. It was, people wrote about angels and demons and talked about them. And in our world today is actually coming around a little bit more like the first century AD than it was 50 or 60 years ago. People believed that demons had the capacity to rule over the life of individuals and communities, and steered people into lives of brokenness and chaos and violence and self-destruction. That's what demons did. And so Luke tells us there is a man possessed by a demon. All the demons have three things in common. They cause self-destructive behavior in the victim, and they're up on the screen for you to see. The victim feels trapped in that condition, and then they separate the victim from the community, or the family, the clan, of which one is a part. In this case, in the scripture, it tells us the man lived in the tombs, and tombs were often burying places in caves in the hilly regions of the area. The Golan Heights were filled with caves where shepherds would go and take cover for night, or people would go and bury their family members. The man who is possessed screams. He's naked, and he's out of control. That's not so unfamiliar to us. If you venture down into some of the darker places in our communities, in our cities, you see people out of control. You see people screaming. And yes, sometimes they are without appropriate clothing. If we define demons as those forces that have taken hold of us and preventing us from what God intends us to fully be, then yes, perhaps we are too possessed by demons like Jesus encountered. And I'm not talking about the demons that you see in the movies. Forget about that science fiction fairy tale stuff. I'm not talking about red-horned devilish creatures. I'm talking about those things that hold us captive. What are they? You can name them as well as I can. Their mental illness, their drug addiction and alcoholism, their paranoia and depression, their anxiety and their destructive habits, and so on. And so in dramatic fashion in this lesson, Jesus heals the man. He delivers the man from his affliction. And the point of the story is that there is a power, most of us call it God, but there is a power that can deliver us from what keeps us broken. The key to success of Alcoholics Anonymous is the 12-step program, and the first 3 steps exactly deal with what this lesson is dealing with. The first step is we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction and our lives have become unmanageable. Like the man in the story whose life was unmanageable. The second step is we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Like Jesus helping the man in this lesson. And step 3 is we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. As the man turned his life over to the power of God in this lesson. We need God. We need a higher power to turn to when our lives are broken, because I don't know many of us who can do it by ourselves. And we need a village. We need community. In almost all of Jesus' healing stories, there is restoration back to the community, the townspeople, the family. And so that's why we have places like the Bridge and Houses of Hope and Touchstone and Kia House and Hanu House and the Oxford Houses and Bethany Christian Church, who provides a place for 50 people struggling or who are clean but who have struggled with drug addiction in their life every single week. For the healing of demons today, the fellowship of family and congregation and community is key to the restoration of life. Because, yes, rarely can we free ourselves of our demons. And so we need help from family, from church, from specialists, from doctors, from spiritual leaders, and for those who have studied and can provide us with the wisdom we need to cope with our demons. At the end of the story, the man had been healed, and the Greek word that's used is sozo, S-O-Z-O. And sozo can be translated as saved. The man was saved. It can be translated as had been healed or delivered, and it can be translated as made whole. He's not only delivered from a demon and not only cured of this terrible burden, but he's healed and restored back to a life of wholeness. And isn't that the key to places like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous? Whatever addiction we struggle with. And so comes the important last verse of the story. In verse 39 of chapter 8 it says, "He went away proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him." And so the man not only becomes a follower of Jesus, but he offers testimony of what Jesus has done for him as well. The entire New Testament is testimony. It's a record of the early experience of the early Christians who experienced the transforming power of God in their lives. And so these people wrote down their testimonies that they had from the people around them. Yes, this is a story that took place 2,000 years ago. And we live in a postmodern world, and sometimes we feel that our postmodern world doesn't have too much to do with the world of 2,000 years ago, the biblical world. But there's more. There is more wisdom than we ever know. There is more parallel than we imagine in our world and in the world of Jesus and his followers. We too are living this story. We are living this story. Jesus has touched us in some way, delivered us from some of life's brokenness that has threatened to maybe destroy our life in some way. And that's a great blessing. And so, we have then felt called to be a part of the community that seeks to give testimony to what God has done. That's why we're here, church. That's why we're here. Testimony is not about fixing people. Rather, it speaks of God making wholeness out of human woundedness, human incompleteness. And we are still with Jesus on the journey through life. Testimony. What has God done for you? How has the life and the way of Jesus transformed you? We shouldn't be so silent about that. We should tell it. We should tell our story, because our story has the ability to transform and touch people on the way.